We've learned that if-else statements let us make simple binary decisions in our code, meaning our code can pick between two different options. If-else statements by themselves seem pretty limited, but we can use them in clever ways to solve all kinds of more complex problems. The first one we'll look at is stringing together multiple if-else statements into what we can call an if-else-if structure. An if-else-if structure will let us choose one option from a bunch of options. Later on, we'll learn about another structure that lets us choose one option from many, but if-else-if is an easy one for beginners to use. To see how this works, we'll look at a basic user interface with a menu. This record store software will show a list of music genres to choose from so that the user can find out the top-selling album in that category. These test cases show how it should work, and I've already put together some basic code to get us started. You can download this starter file from the link in the description, or just pause the video and type it up. There's not a lot to it. Let's go ahead and run it once just to see how it looks. It lets the user type in a number, but the program just ends after they make their choice, so our job is to complete it. Now, I want us to keep practicing using methods and passing data back and forth, so for this program we're not using top-level statements, and I've set this up with a method called topSeller that will look up and return the correct information. We'll look closer in a moment, but for now it just returns an empty string. I'm going to collapse the header block at the top to free up some screen space. And down here is that full method so far, so this is a good place to pause and copy down my code if you need to. You can see that it just declares an empty string called title and then returns that. Our main job with this work is going to be to write the logic that sets that variable to the correct value before it gets returned. Right now, the program doesn't even call the topSeller method, so I need to get that working first. You can see that I've already declared a few variables that we can use to help with this. Album is the information I'm trying to retrieve, so I'll use an assignment statement to call our method and store the returned data in the album variable. topSeller requires a parameter to indicate which genre we're looking up, so I'll pass the input variable along since that's what the user has typed in. But that gives us an error because the topSeller method is expecting an int and we're giving it a string. So we need to do a conversion before we can call the method. We do have an int variable called selection, and that's what this is for. So I'm going to use convert.toInt32 to convert the string input into an integer that we can then pass on to the method. Okay, I'll fix my extra parentheses here, and then I'll change our parameter from input to selection so that it's getting that integer instead. And this seems like a good place to try running it just to make sure I haven't broken anything yet. So there's no visible difference from the last time we ran it because we're not outputting anything. So I'll add a console.writeLine statement, and I'm going to use the string symbol, or what you guys might call the $sign, so that I can easily output my variable by putting it in curly braces inside my statement. Again, this is called string interpolation. It's covered elsewhere. Remember that you need to include that string symbol in the correct spot for this to work, but it should insert the value of whatever is in the album variable when it does my output. So let's go ahead and try that. All right, that's a pretty good start. It's outputting our message and we think it's including the value of album, but it's tough to tell since album doesn't have anything in it yet. But our user interface seems to be all done, so now we can turn our attention to the decision logic of this program, which we're going to handle inside this topSeller method. Notice that I left some room between the declaration statement and the return statement, and that's where I'm going to put all my if statements. I'm checking the value of the parameter, the value that was passed in, and I've named that genre. Remember, we're checking for equality and we're not assigning a value, so I need to use two equal symbols here. That's a really easy mistake to make. If the user has selected number 1, I'm going to return Paranoid by Black Sabbath. I happen to remember that one, but I can always confirm that by going back up to my test cases and see what I had established already. And notice that I'm not using console.writeLine here. The output is handled in my main method. Inside this method, I'm just returning the value and I don't want to do any output. Let's run this and see how it's working. It does output the correct album if I enter 1. And of course, if I enter anything else, it doesn't have an album name because I haven't written that code yet. And with that working, I can start to think about my other genres. I can add a second if statement right under this first one, and it'll handle when genre is equal to 2, which will be an REM album. Let's run that. And of course I have a mistake in my code. I put a 3 in there instead of a 2, so I'll fix that. There we go. And just to be safe, I'm going to try it again and enter 1 to make sure I didn't break that one. And it looks good. Now, I've simply added a second if statement, and in this case, that works just fine. What I don't like about this is that it's not very efficient. If the genre is equal to 1, it's going to pick the Black Sabbath album like it should, but then it's still going to go on and check to see if it's equal to 2. It's obviously not possible for it to be equal to 1 and to be equal to 2, but the computer doesn't realize that, so it's just going to keep checking all those numbers, which is a waste of time. It's better if our structure stops checking once it finds a match, and we can do that by adding this second if statement as the else block of the first if statement. Now this structure says, if genre is equal to 1, then set the title to paranoid, and that'll be the end of the decisions. But if it's not, then let's check and see if it's a 2. We should confirm that it still works. And I'll try both options. And I'll try one that we haven't written yet, which won't find an album. You might notice that even though I said it's more efficient this way, it doesn't seem like the program ran any faster. The difference is so minor that we can't even tell, but it's still a good programming practice and we want you to develop good habits here. And in some situations, we might have choices that kind of overlap, so it will cause problems if we keep checking after we find a match. We can take a look at an example of that another time. It's all pretty easy from here because I can just chain together as many else-if statements as I need in order to cover all my choices. So let's try it with 3. And through the magic of video editing, I'll save you from watching me type the rest of them. I also saved you from watching all of my testing, but I did go through each menu option. I'm basically just trying my test cases from the beginning of the program. But I noticed that I do have one test case that's not addressed. If I enter a choice that's not one of the menu numbers, it should indicate that. And my code right now doesn't do that. It just returns kind of a blank from when we first started writing this code. There are a few different ways we can address that, and which one I use just depends on the specific situation. I could write another else if to address that one test case that doesn't pass. And that works in terms of passing the test case, but it doesn't really address the problem, right? I have no idea what wrong value somebody's going to input, and it's not practical to just make a bunch of if statements to handle them all. What I really need is a catch-all value that gets assigned if none of the if statements evaluate to true. To do that, I can just get rid of the check on this last block and make it a plain else statement. The idea now is that it will check each if statement in order. If it finds a match, it'll run that block of code and then jump down to the end of the whole structure. If it gets to the bottom and it hasn't found a match yet, it'll run this else block. It's kind of like a default value. I'll go ahead and run this again to make sure that's how it works. My test case works, but more importantly, it works no matter what invalid integer I enter. And that pretty much does it for this particular program. When you have a situation in which you want to run one block of code out of a bunch of different options, the if-else-if structure should be your go-to. We're going to move on and see some other things we can do with decisions, but I encourage you to spend a little time practicing if-else-if before you go on.